Before we get to that moment of baptizing Raymond, I'm going to ask Ed de Furia to come up and share how those have walked with him in his journey and encouraged him in his faith, the saints of his life, as a reminder that as Christians, when we give to our community, we are giving not to ourselves, but to making saints of God for the sake of the world. Ed.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As Father Dirk said, my name is Ed de Furia. I did this at the 8 o'clock service today, and I thought it went pretty well. My wife was at the 8 o'clock service. She gave me notes. And the most important note, or the first note, was you were too brief, you were too short. You got to add back all those stories that you took out to hit the 5 minutes that Father Dirk asked you to speak. So I'm not sure where we're going, but get comfortable because the boss has spoken. So I chose to talk about saints. Well, Father Dirk asked me to talk about saints, and I chose a little S saint, my grandmother. And I think to put the story in context, I want to tell you a little bit about her. So she was born in 1905. So she was of that generation that they saw a lot. You know, she lived through the first great pandemic there, the Spanish flu of the 1917, 1918. She lived through World War I as a child. She lived through the Great Depression. She lived through World War II. And she was widowed fairly young and raised 2 children on her own at a time that it was not so easy to do that. I don't think it's ever easy, but try doing it in the 40s. And I think one of the most memorable moments for me and my grandmother was she was one of 13 children. And by the way, I was talking earlier. That was a disputed number. Some say it was 15, some say it was 12. I guess they didn't keep such good records back in late 1800s. But the only one of her siblings I knew was her brother, my Uncle Silvio. And when he died, he was the last except for her. I remember coming home as a child. I was a kid then, coming home from the funeral. And she said, gee, now I'm all alone. And she was in her 80s then. I was like, Graham, you're not alone. She's like, no, I'm all alone. She watched her 13 siblings pass before her. So what does that mean? She was not an easy woman. She was all business. If you're thinking of the old Italian, again, she was about this big. If you're thinking of the sweet old Italian lady who baked cookies and pinched your cheeks, this was not her. I often think, was it that life she lived that made her that way, or was she that way? I don't know, but she was tough. But she was very special to me. And I was her favorite, for obvious reasons. So why was she a saint? I think for this definition, a saint's somebody who helps you with your faith, helps you get closer to God. And she did that for me by showing me that God is even in the little things. Every night when I was a boy, her room was next to mine. I said she was widowed. She lived with her daughter, who was my mother. She would walk down the hall, and before she went to bed, she would stop in my room. She would lean over the bed, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And yep, he was the Holy Ghost then. It hadn't been upgraded yet to the Spirit. And that was it. If I was asleep, she did it. If I was awake, she did it. Sometimes she'd jostle the covers and wake me in the process. But if I tried to talk to her, she had nothing to say. It was all business. She did her prayer. She turned, walked out of the room. And I asked her, why do you do that, Graham? She said, because it's important. It's important to remind you that God's up there, and it's important to remind God that we're down here. She thinks reminders are important. If you went down the hall a little bit to her room and looked around, you wouldn't see much. Again, it was sparse. She didn't have a lot of time for nonsense. You'd have hanging on the wall, you'd see a cross over her bed. That would be the only thing hanging on the walls. And if you came to my house, you'd see a cross hanging over my bed now, too. On her dresser would be a couple of little knickknacks. But the biggest thing on the dresser would be a saint, a little statue. Not a big one, but it was the biggest thing there of a saint with palm from last Palm Sunday wrapped around it. The next Palm Sunday, she'd take that off, collect all the palm in the house, and burn it. And lots of other things sometimes with the palm. But that's what she did. It was important to her. And that lesson stuck with me, that these little reminders keep us close to God, or close to what we consider important in our lives. And I've used that lesson. I see some of my confirmation kids over there. I use that lesson all the time in confirmation. I tell the kids, think of your life, if your life is a TV show or a movie, and people were watching it. Would they know you're a Christian? We put a lot of things in our lives that let people know what we like. But is God one of them? Got some props here. We all have lots of things. It says, hey, what do we like? Who's our favorite team? I know some people. Who's in faith? No, who's faith? Stay with us. Favorite schools. Right? We all have things in our lives that tell us what's important. How many of us have things like this? Right? Well, my grandmother, one of the reasons this exists, my grandmother said, it is important. Remember God in all the little things. Make it part of your life. And if anybody wants to put a face to the name, I put a picture back there on the back table of my grandmother as kind of as I remember her. If you want on your way out, take a look. And finally, I say, her name was Elizabeth Campana Durante. My oldest daughter's named Elizabeth. And that's no coincidence. She was named for my grandmother because I too think that reminders are important. Thank you.
I would like to invite